My guest today is Jesse Alexander, who runs the YouTube channel The Great War, which will be the topic of this week's episode. But before that, we're gonna take a little bit of your time to talk about a charity for Ukraine that he runs. And I just want to say that I donated myself, and I will recommend everyone else to do the same. A link will be in the description. If you want to take a donate, you can donate from $10 to whatever amount you like. And first of all, what is this charity about your charity for Ukraine?
Yeah, thanks so much for having me on the show, by the way. Um, I volunteer here in Vienna, where I live, with a small charity, a locally run charity called Ukraine, YO Ukraine. And basically, I'm a volunteer there. So I don't run it, it's run by local Ukrainians, and it sends humanitarian aid to Ukraine, and they specialize in medical aid. So medicine, medical devices, medical supplies, bandages, surgical instruments, wheelchairs, all those kinds of things, rehabilitation equipment for people who've been injured, and ambulances as well. They've sent about a dozen ambulance vehicles that they've bought and refurbished and sent there. And so I try to be a part of that, and I try to help them out because I believe in the cause and I think it's the right thing to do. So I help make people aware. So I hope that anyone listening to this show who's interested in finding a way to help Ukraine directly, because they're not some big bureaucratic international charity that's going to take time, that it's, a lot of the money might go to administration. They're not like that, right? They're a very, very small team of volunteers. No one works, no one gets paid to work with them. And they run out of a donated space, a small storage warehouse and office. And that's what they do. So, and they have skin in the game. They are from Ukraine, the core of the team anyway, and the founders. So I think it makes sense. They're a good choice for direct aid, direct and uncomplicated aid. And they post all over their social media. We sent a truck. It has your generator in it. It ended up here, and here's a picture of it, and so on. So I think that they are one of those kind of charities that make sense to give to. So of course, I encourage anybody listening who's interested to click on the link and check them out.
Fantastic. I have, and like I said, I recommend everyone else to do the same. Now, let's talk about the Great War, which is known better as the First World War.
Let's.
And I want to begin with the state of Europe before the outbreak of the war, because it has been at peace for quite some time. Of course, they fought war in colonial wars, etc. But Europe itself been at peace. So was it quite a shock when the shot in Sarajevo came and people didn't know, or was people kind of pumped, for lack of better words, for war at that point? Very prepared.
Well, now you've opened up several different interesting cans of worms there. First of all, let's talk about Europe being at peace for a long time. I mean, yes, it has been at peace in 1914. It has been at peace at least since 1871. But oftentimes we kind of think about it being maybe a bit more peaceful than it actually was, because there were quite a lot of colonial wars that different European powers were involved with. So yes, there was no great power war since 1871. But even so, many Germans and Frenchmen still remember 1871, still participated in 1871, were still affected by their experience in 1870, 71, I should say. There's also been quite a bit of research that emphasizes the violence without war. So how much violence was there in European society? How much did people beat their kids, and how did that affect the generations of people? So I think, yes, Europe is at peace in the classical term of there are no European states going to full-on war against each other, but there was still quite a bit of connections to violence, both through the colonies and then if you look at it kind of in a more social history sense. And I think that's worth keeping in mind as well.
One could argue that the Balkan War kind of was
Yes, of
to
course. How
Europe.
could I forget? We did a great episode, a very fascinating episode on the Balkan Wars. Yes, of course, there are wars in the Balkans. Not only the two Balkan Wars, but there's a war between Greece and Turkey in 1897 as well. There's the Russo-Japanese War in 1904-05. which of course only involves Russia of the European powers, but still, I think that just reinforces this point that violence is still lurking on the edges and under the surface in European society, and especially in people's minds. War is still a normal and legitimate thing to happen in international politics. And now, today, especially for us in so-called Western countries in Europe and North America, I think since World War II, we've tended to move away from the idea that war is normal and it's going to happen. And sometimes we want to have a war, that it will further the state's interests. That people didn't think that way in 1914. People still assumed that there could be wars and they were a legitimate way of furthering a state's interest. Now, they were very cautious about them because, of course, they're risky and destructive. But I still think that that's a little bit of an underestimated aspect of it when people think about that. As far as the assassination is concerned, people didn't expect it to start a war right away. I mean, yes, it made some headlines, but at first, at the end of June, it didn't seem like war was going to break out. That only became a real danger later than in July, of course, when the Austro-Hungarians kind of refused the Serbian response to their ultimatum. And then that kind of domino effect begins, where everyone ends up getting involved after Russia mobilizes. So,
how long time does the mobilization take before Kaiser Wilhelm and the Central Powers decided that we should declare war because of the shot in Sarajevo, and how long time does it take for the forces to move on?
Well, I think the question is about the mobilization of the Central Powers.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, what happens is the shot in Sarajevo, the famous shot, it doesn't cause anybody to mobilize right away.
Yeah.
Nobody's worried about mobilizing. When that first domino, if you will, falls, is when Russia decides to partially mobilize. And this puts Germany in a difficult strategic position. And it pushes on a major weakness that German planners, or a major mistake, I would say, in retrospect, that German planners have committed, which is essentially Germany fears being surrounded by its potential adversaries, right? So France and Russia on either side of Germany, they have an alliance. And they have this alliance because they fear Germany, right? So if Germany's going to fight both of them, and the German planners assume that if war happens, they're going to have to fight both France and Germany. This creates an issue because you can't fight them both at the same time when they're at full strength, when they're mobilized. So it becomes a game of speed, right? Can Germany mobilize fast enough and attack France quickly enough and defeat them before Russia can fully mobilize, because it's so much bigger, the infrastructure is not as good, it will take Russia longer to mobilize. That's at least the assumption that the German planners are working on. So they have this famous plan, right, which you and probably many of your listeners have heard of before, the Schlieffen plan. And this plan basically says, yeah, we're going to mobilize fast in the West. We're going to march into France, defeat them in 6 weeks or so. Then we're going to shift our army to the east, and then Russia will be mobilized and ready to fight, but we will also be ready to fight them in the east. That's
you
the
know
idea.
the famous saying, tomorrow in Paris, right? That the Germans said.
And so the problem for the Germans now in this July crisis in 1914 is that the problem starts with Russia, and Russia is mobilizing to support Serbia, right, against Austria-Hungary. But now the Germans are in a panic in a way, because Russia's already mobilizing. This means the plan is not going to work, right? But they don't have another plan. There's this kind of rigid planning cycle that exists partially due to technology like railways, and how can you use them, how can you plan for them, but also a little bit of that military necessity starts to take over political situations, Right? And this makes it very dangerous then, because the military logic is inescapable. Then you have to keep going, otherwise you're taking a security risk. So what happens is then Germany decides, well, okay, we cannot go halfway on this, right? Yes, okay, Russia has said it's partially mobilizing, which is another story, because that was very difficult for the Russians to do only partially. But this is too much of a threat, and essentially then Germany declares war and invades France, even though that's not where this crisis began. It didn't begin as a German-French crisis or conflict. It began as a Russian-Austrian-Serbian conflict.
I want to get back to the Eastern Front, of course, in a little bit, but I
Sure.
want to begin with the Western Front because
Okay.
trench warfare was a German invention, wasn't it? That the Germans came up with that. But would you say that kind of by creating this trench warfare that we're going to talk about now, that it kind of that's partially the reason why there was so little territorial gain on the Western Front, that was what was stopping the territorial gain in the first place. While it saved life, arguably, it also kind of stopped the gaining of territorial gain.
Yes. It's interesting. Germany didn't really fully invent trench warfare. I think they were, for most of the war, the reason why we connect them maybe a bit more with successful trench war tactics is because they were on the defensive in the West for most of the war. There are exceptions to that, 1914, 1918, but generally the Germans are doing more defending in the West. So they invest more in their trench systems because they want to stay in them for longer. And the trench systems that they're in now are part of the plan to defend. So you end up where the Germans have, on the balance, better trenches, deeper, more reinforced, and so on and so forth, than the Allies do. And partly that's for strategic reasons. They can choose to be on the defensive in the West for some of the time. The Allies, they have a lot of political pressure to attack, to kick the Germans out of the occupied Belgian and French territories. So this is why the German trench systems are generally better, deeper, stronger. But trench systems and using trenches as a part of warfare has existed before. In the Crimean War, they used trenches. In the American Civil War, they used trenches. In the Russo-Japanese War, they used trenches as well. What's interesting is that it's a response to the state of the technology of the time in a way, right? Because the defensive is far more powerful than the offensive.
And
right? If you're
I want
attacking,
to again draw a line to the modern the
yeah,
Ukrainian war, where you can see that clearly defensive is working for the Ukrainians, whereas offensive is not working for Russia at the moment.
right, and there are different reasons for that in each case, right? In the First World War, you have very powerful weapons like machine guns and artillery, but they're more effective in defense because the machine guns, especially at the beginning of the war, they're heavy and they're not super mobile, and you need horses to move your artillery guns, right? Well, if you have a trench system, you're not moving that easily, and your guns can't keep up with your advancing infantry. And normally, the way to have movement warfare, mobile warfare, is that you go around the flank, you go around the side and attack the side of the enemy army, and that's a weak point, and then everything changes and someone wins. Or you break through the middle, and then you send in your cavalry, and they can exploit that. They can go in behind the enemy, create chaos, and so on. You can't do that when trench warfare begins. There is no flank. There's just more trenches all the way to the English Channel. So you can't turn the flank, and you can't use cavalry very easily because, well, they're going to get mown down by the machine guns. And it's very difficult if your infantry are advancing, you want to pull up your artillery to support you. Well, good luck moving your heavy guns through a landscape that has all been churned up and become muddy from artillery fire exploding there, and over trenches and so on. So this creates a real dilemma that isn't solved until 1918, until they develop a whole system of combined arms warfare with new artillery techniques, with new infantry tactics, and with the help of tanks, so mobile armored firepower, and then in conjunction with intensive use of aircraft observation as well. So all these different pieces, plus some new tactics and technology, have to come together to break the trench deadlock. And of course, that's helped by the fact that Germany is exhausted in 1918 as well. So all that has to come together to break the trench warfare deadlock in the West. In the East, it's not as much of a deadlock. There's still a lot of movement. There are huge offensives. It goes back and forth. But in the West, that is the case.
So did the plan to have like we said talked about it, and especially in the I'm going to talk about it by the end of the episode, but as we talked about in the and you see this in All Quiet on the Western Front, that they say tomorrow in Paris. Did they plan to take Paris like kind of in blitzkrieg sense, or that you said they didn't intentionally but just tended to protect the borders in the beginning and then take Paris as if the defense was successful?
Well, yeah, the German plan in 1914 was not to attack Paris directly immediately, right? I mean, this makes sense. It's a huge city, and you don't want your army to be absorbed in a long siege of such a big city unless you have to. They besieged Paris in 1870-71, but at that point in the Franco-Prussian War, right? But at that point, they had already defeated the French field armies, so they had the ability to defeat Paris. There were no other major imminent threats to the German alliance of armies in France in 1870-71. But in 1914, you're still dealing with a fully functional, very powerful, very capable French army in the field. So the German idea is, well, we'll attack through Belgium and come around on the flank, right, and push the French from the east. So they would come around, make a semicircle, and then come behind the French. And you wouldn't have to fight over Paris. You would defeat the French army and then deal with Paris after that. Maybe it surrenders, maybe you have to besiege it for a while, but the French army is the main target.
So let's talk about the Eastern Front for a while, and we talked about this on Twitter as well, that the Russian army was in a terrible mess when it began the war. So Nicholas II had not modernized the army. It was you just got three rounds of ammunition, and it was ill equipped, put it that way. They weren't very well trained, the soldiers. So how did that work for the Russians with such a terrible preparation and with so few ammunition to go on when they started mobilizing and then eventually war against Germany?
Well, I think, that idea that Russia was so badly prepared, it has become more popular after the war, partially because the Russians lost some important battles against the Germans at the very beginning, the Battle of Tannenberg, the Battle of Masurian Lakes, right, in August and September 1914. Then they lose a big battle in 1915 as well with the Gorlitz-Tarnów offensive. But I think that's been exaggerated in the popular presentations of the war. The Russian army is not as powerful or not as well trained and well equipped as the Germans or the French are, but they're not as bad as we think they are. Actually, they are. The army's made up of conscripts who have training. They have some decent training. The artillery is not of poor quality, for example. What happens, and at the beginning they have enough rifles and ammunition. They end up with some shortages of weapons of different kinds, also artillery shells, in 1915. And this is a big reason why they suffer major defeats in 1915, or a partial reason. But in 1914, they're expecting and are expected to perform better than they do. So things are not quite as bad for the Russian army as maybe we imagine sometimes. The problem for the Russians is they really, well, one of the problems, there are many. They were trying to modernize over the previous years, but they had not gotten as far in their plan as they wanted to, because they'd been defeated, right, by the Japanese in 1904-05. So it weakened Russia, but it also spurred some rearmament program, but it wasn't completed in 1914. So they don't have as much equipment as they wanted. But one of their major problems is they have trouble with command and control and coordinating the movements of those armies. And their commanders make mistakes. And this is why they lose so badly in East Prussia, because the two armies that they have advancing into East Prussia, they don't coordinate enough. They don't communicate properly. There's the famous example that they communicate over the radio in the clear, right? And this is a lack of professionalism in that sense. And so the Germans are able to beat them each separately. So I think the main Russian difficulty is commanding and command decisions with these massive armies. I mean, in history before this, there's never been such massive armies in the field for such a long time. So it is difficult. Everyone has some issues with command and control. The Germans, two of their armies separate as they move differently in France, and they go off plan a little bit. This is one of the reasons why the Battle of the Marne can happen, where the French stop the Germans in 1914. And the Russians suffer quite badly from that and lose in East Prussia in 1914. The Austrians suffer terribly from that in 1914 on the Eastern Front, but to the south in today's Western Ukraine, which at the time, of course, part of it belonged to Austria-Hungary, part of it belonged to the Russian Empire. The Austrians get all separated from each other, and they go too far when they move into the Russian Empire in 1914. And that allows the Russians to get into an advantageous position and inflict a very, very heavy defeat against the Austrians.
Something we have to talk about as well is that a little country that is in the way, which is Poland, and as you know, it was divided in the 18th century between the great powers, Habsburgs, Germany, and Russia at the time. And it seemed to me that what the Germans wanted was an independent Poland after the war, when they had won, that they wanted a puppet Poland to work in their favor. Is this correct, or is this just what has this been again?
Yeah, the Germans, of course, as the war goes on and each side becomes under more strain, and they're willing to make more and more compromises. They're willing to consider different political solutions or geopolitical solutions than they would ever have conceived of in 1914. And Germany's no different. They do float this idea of a semi-independent Polish kingdom in order to motivate Poles living in Germany, Austria-Hungary, and even in the occupied Russian part of Poland, occupied by the Germans and Austrians, that is, once they capture it in 1915. They want to motivate Poles to fight with the Central Powers. Of course, the Poles living in Austria-Hungary or in Germany, they can be conscripted into the army and they fight with their respective armies of the states in which they live. But yes, there is this idea to create some sort of semi-independent Polish state, which Napoleon also did, right? Back in the day, the Duchy of Warsaw in 1807, he created for a similar reason, right? To use in a conflict with Russia, basically. Yeah. The problem for Austria-Hungary, it's not so easy for them, this idea, because a big chunk of what will later become the Polish Republic is in Austria-Hungary. So they are a bit uncomfortable with the idea then of an independent Poland right on the border. So there are some considerations like this, but they don't really get that far. There is no functioning state of Poland, puppet or otherwise, during the war. It's just an occupied zone, the Russian part of it, let's say.
But that was the plan for Poland once the Central Powers had won, right? To create this puppet for Germany.
Well, they do end up eventually creating a Central Powers controlled Ukraine briefly in 1918, right? But I don't want to take away from a future question. So yes, there were some ideas, and the plan was discussed for some kind of Polish state under Central Powers influence, but it never gets done.
Now, before we move on to the different aspects of the war, I want to talk about Austria-Hungary as well, because I will focus on that as essential powers, because I think that is vastly overlooked aspect of the Great War. And I might want to focus as much on the Allied powers this time right now, but of course we will come back to them as well, or the Entente powers that were in the control then. But I want to talk about Austria-Hungary as well, because and you might prove me wrong again, but as the way I understood this is that they were poorly equipped with the army and poorly trained soldiers at the time, which is interesting to me because, you know, considering they go into war, they had such poorly prepared troops.
Yes, the Austro-Hungarian army was the least prepared and least well equipped of the major European powers, right? Excepting the Ottomans. Let's keep them out of this for now.
Yeah.
But in July 1914, or in August 1914, the Ottomans are not involved yet, right? They join later that fall, and the Italians are also not involved. So of those initial 5 powers that are involved, the Austro-Hungarian army is the weakest by some margin. And part of the reason for this is money. They don't have any, right? The army's budget has not kept up with that of its rivals for some years. Part of the reason is political infighting in the Austro-Hungarian state. Since 1867, it's actually kind of 2 states in one, just joined by fiscal policy, by foreign policy, and by the army. Everything else is kind of separate. And so these difficulties of governance in Austria-Hungary, in addition to the fact that they're not as wealthy, they don't generate as much, the economy is not as large as Germany or France or Britain, they are not able to keep their army as well equipped, or in some cases as well trained. Although they have quite a few decently trained troops, it's not like none of them are well trained, but especially they're lacking in equipment, and they're lacking in the most modern kinds of equipment as well. And this plays a big role in the difficulties that the Austro-Hungarian army has, especially at the very start of the war. So they try to knock Serbia out quickly. They expect it's going to be a quick victory, but the Serbians are tough. They're fully mobilized, and they are well equipped with French artillery.
It's quite a difficult terrain too in Serbia to conquer. There's a lot of mountains. There's a it's not easy terrain to blitzkrieg on
that's right. And the Serbian army is quite experienced. They just fought 2 wars. They just fought the Balkan Wars, right? So they know what they're doing. And they have French artillery. Not a ton of it, but still, it's good. So the Austrians fail, right, to knock Serbia out of the war in 1914. And then they also fail catastrophically on the Eastern Front in the fall of 1914. And they lose hundreds of thousands of men. And their army is much smaller because they couldn't afford to draft as many men in peacetime, to conscript as many men in peacetime. They wanted to save money. So the pool of trained men that they have is less as a proportion than the French or the Germans or the whoever, the French and Germans in this case, let's say. So Austria-Hungary quickly finds itself in a near catastrophic situation where they still have a southern front against the Serbs, and they have lost the first campaign in the east against the Russians. And then in early 1915, they make another absolutely catastrophic mistake where they try to launch another offensive against the Russians in the Carpathian Mountains in winter. And it's a total disaster. It goes nowhere, and hundreds of thousands more Austro-Hungarian soldiers are lost. So within 6 months of the start of the war, most of the Austro-Hungarian army of July 1914 is gone. They're dead, they're wounded, or they've been taken prisoner by the Russians. And they've been replaced by reserves that have been called up, or new men who've been conscripted. But that means the quality of the army suffers even more. So the beginning of the war is an absolute disaster for Austria-Hungary, but they do survive, right? And then they do go on to continue to be able to fight and fight in some cases effectively in Italy, for example. But they take a terrible beating at the start of the war. That's no question about that.
So we talked most about Central Powers now. Let's talk about Allied power as well before we move on to other aspects of the war. How prepared were they for this Great War, as it will be called later on?
Well, that depends on what we mean by prepared. I think the French have an extremely effective army, and they are aware of some of their weaknesses. So one of France's weaknesses is population, right? They don't have as many people as Germany by a wide margin. So I think France has about 42 million at the time, and Germany has about 65 million people. That means a lot more soldiers potentially to serve in your army. And France understands this. So they, in the years leading up to the war, they extend the time of mandatory conscription from 2 years to 3 years. So this increases the size of their peacetime army. So the French are not outnumbered by the Germans in 1914 in terms of soldiers on the ground in France. So they have made some good decisions. The French have prior to the war breaking out. What's difficult from the French point of view at the start of the war is, like most of the other powers, they don't know exactly what to expect. They think that they have learned the lessons of the Russo-Japanese War and military tactics and so on. But of course, no one realizes just how effective the defensive is going to be. No one expects trench warfare to begin. So, of course, the French, they decide to attack, right? Their plan is Plan 17, and the idea is we'll attack Germany along the border between France and Germany. But that attack fails, right? Because they're using tactics that are not effective. And they suffer a lot of casualties as well. What the French do, though, what they are able to do is quickly recover. They're good. I mean, the French are good in 1914. We tend to criticize them a lot for their failure in the offensive of 1914 and how many losses they took, and don't they look silly in their red pants and so on and so forth. But they are a good army. They are the second best army in the world after the Germans, right? So they are able to shift their armies around. They're able to make use of their excellent artillery, and they're able to win the Battle of the Marne and stop the German invasion. Another problem the French have, though, that I should point out when I'm talking about artillery, they don't have enough heavy artillery. They have expected a war of movement, as have others, but they don't invest enough, as it turns out, in heavy artillery. So once you have a position war, trench war, you need heavy artillery to blow up trenches, to blow up dugouts. And the light artillery the French have is probably the best in the world, right? The 75 millimeter. But they don't have enough heavy artillery. They have to take it from old fortresses and that kind of thing. It's not enough. The Germans have tons of heavy artillery. They have invested in heavy artillery. So this creates a problem for the French that they're not able to start solving until 1916.
So when does Britain join in the war? Do they wait to see how well the French do, or do they immediately join as soon as the offensive and defensive begins in the war? Because as you know, in German World War II, Britain kind of hesitate, and there is kind of this proxy war on the Western Front in the beginning of the war before Britain joined in. Is this the case in World War One as well, or do they immediately join in?
Well, they don't join in on the same day. But they join in on August 4th. So they join in a few days later. And the reason is because, Britain does not have a binding alliance with France and Russia. They have friendly agreements, these entente cordiale, right? But with France, that's why we call the alliance the entente, as you referred to it earlier. And there is some hesitation in Britain. Should we get involved? This is obviously a conflict that started, that's not directly at the core of British interests in the Balkans. But there are two factors here that are critical. One is Britain is committed always, usually, to a balance of power in Europe. Britain never wants one state to become too powerful. They will always oppose that. They'll always join whatever alliance is against the most powerful European country.
I would like to add that I find that kind of ironic, considering they own half the world at the point that they don't want them want one power in Europe, but own half the world. That's fine, no problem there.
Yeah, yeah. That hey, no question about that. So what happens is they're very nervous about Germany's growing power in the years before the war, especially its navy. This is perceived as a big threat to British power and British interests in the British Empire. So they're not very happy about Germany's policies and what they perceive as the German threat. But that's a different thing from then taking the step of going to war against another great power, especially if you have not been directly attacked. What pushes Britain over the edge is this idea of the balance of power. They're afraid that Germany will win the war and become too powerful, and therefore it's in British interests to stop that from happening, to join France. And the Germans invade Belgium, which is neutral, and which the neutrality of Belgium is guaranteed by an international treaty from the 1830s that Britain signed. So, of course, sometimes great powers break international treaties, but usually not, because the whole international system depends on following the treaties that are signed. In this case, it helps to give Britain a diplomatic and moral case to go to war, because Germany has very obviously broken the international convention, the international treaty about the neutrality of Belgium. And then the Germans start committing atrocities in Belgium, which reinforces that moral case on the British side. So politically, they can say, well, okay, even if part of our motivation is just geopolitics, we want to stop Germany from becoming too powerful, we also have a moral case that we can put out in public and say, look, Germany has violated the treaty and it's committing atrocities in Belgium and so on and so forth. So this is kind of the situation as to why Britain joins on the 4th of August.
Like I said, they were hesitant in joining. Do you think that they kind of in the beginning saw this as a continuation of the Franco-Prussian War in the beginning? Is that what they kind of looked at this war in the
I think the British always have had a certain distance from conflicts on the continent. I mean, they do and they don't. Obviously, they're involved because they're very close, but at the same time, they have the luxury of the English Channel and the Royal Navy, so they have the luxury of having a bit of wiggle room, let's say. And this is the case in 1914, although they make a fairly quick decision to go to war. I don't know if I don't think they would see it as the continuation of the Franco-Prussian War, just because the political order in Europe changed quite a bit. When the Franco-Prussian War breaks out, in Britain, generally, there's more sympathy for Prussia, right? Because the Napoleonic Wars were not that long ago. Some older people still remembered them in their own lifetime. There's this traditional rivalry between Britain and France, of course. And so even though they fought together in the Crimea in 1855 or 53 to 56, let's say, there's no real public love for France in Britain. But the situation in 1914 is different, because France is no longer the most powerful state, right? Here we have this idea of the balance of power. It's Germany. And so Germany seems to be the bigger threat in 1914 for Britain, whereas in 1870, they're not involved in the war, but in general, they don't mind if Prussia takes France down a notch, right? Because France is the most powerful state in 1870 in Europe, at least before they lose that war.
Now let's talk about, you mentioned the Royal Navy, and let's talk about naval power, because at the time, Germany has the largest submarine navy, submarines at the time. They had the biggest submarine warfare, so, and though they're not very good, but how did they use their submarine in the beginning, and how did the naval warfare go? Let's talk briefly about this before we move on.
Yeah, I mean, it's a kind of underappreciated part of the war. I think it doesn't get a lot of attention necessarily in the public eye. One of the reasons is that there's not that many huge, massive, dramatic, decisive battles that have an impact on the war. It's mostly a land war. Nonetheless, sea power is still critical, and there are a few different types of naval war that take place. So you have, at the beginning of the war, you have some German ships that are abroad, and they start to raid. So these warships are, we'll call them surface raiders. So they will attack British or French colonies on the coast. They will attack British or French merchant ships carrying supplies or carrying weapons or what have you. But because the Allies have such naval supremacy, they're able to pretty much either sink or trap these German ships in neutral ports where they can't leave. So then the Northeast Atlantic becomes the main. Well, there is some action in the Mediterranean. There's even some Austro-Hungarian submarines that sink some Allied ships, but basically it's the Northeastern Atlantic. And there you have the naval blockade working. This is probably the most important aspect of the war, is naval blockades. So not naval battles, there are some of those, but naval blockades. And the Allies, of course, blockade Germany. And this has a long-term effect where the German economy struggles more, where the population suffers more, where a few 100,000 people die of malnutrition and other illnesses that are related to that because they can't get enough food. And Germany's short of resources because they cannot import them because the Allies control the seas. This also allows the Allies to capture the German colonies in Africa. The Germans try to use their U-boats to do a similar type of thing. They can't do it with their surface fleet because it's smaller and they don't want to risk it in a kind of suicide mission. Well, they tried it at the very end, but the sailors mutiny in 1918. But the German idea is we will use these new weapons, the U-boats. They don't have that many at the beginning of the war, but eventually then they build quite a few more when they realize that they can have an impact. There's some experimentation with the U-boats. They're also a kind of a new weapon. But the Germans try twice to cut off Britain and basically starve Britain out. In 1915, they launched what's called unrestricted submarine warfare. So unrestricted just means you can sink whatever you see, if it's an allied vessel or if it's a neutral vessel. Now, this is a double-edged sword for the Germans because it means, okay, well, Britain's an island. If we sink enough ships bringing supplies to the British, maybe they will run short of food and they will have to surrender or leave the war or agree to a negotiated peace or whatever. The problem is, and they try this then a second time in 1917. So they started in 1915, they stop it, and then they started again in 1917 as well. There's always submarine warfare, but I'm just talking about unrestricted, where they can sink even neutral ships that are going to Britain. And this is a problem for the Germans because that means they can sink American ships that are bringing supplies to Britain because Britain is buying all sorts of weapons and food and other supplies in the United States, which is neutral for most of the war until 1917. So Germany risks, by trying to starve Britain, Germany risks bringing the United States into the war. And that's why they stopped the unrestricted submarine warfare in 1915, the first time. Then by the beginning of 1917, Germany's situation is so desperate, they gamble. And they think, okay, it's worth the risk. Even if the United States joins the war, it will take them so long to prepare and build up an army that it's worth the risk. We can't hold out very much longer. We know that we have to gamble now. And of course, what happens? They start sinking neutral ships again, and the United States declares war on Germany in April 1917.
And of course, we will come back to that later.
Yeah, that's one of the major impacts of the naval war. Of course, there are some surface battles. The most famous is the Battle of, well, I guess in Scandinavia, it would be Jutland, I think, but anyway, but in English anyway, we call it Jutland. And it's a major battle in 1916. Bunch of big ships shoot at each other. A few of them sink. The Germans kind of perform a little bit better, but it doesn't change anything strategically in a sense because the blockade remains. the German Navy can't operate freely, and the Royal Navy still controls the oceans.
Now, before we move into 2015, and we don't focus on the 2015 on the Ottoman side, I think, but I want to talk first. So we made an episode about this last year in a Christmas special. Yeah, I think you know what I'm talking about now. The infamous Christmas truce of
Yes.
1914. We have to mention it, of course. It would be a crime not to.
Well, all right, let me put it this way. I have never worked in detail on the Christmas truce. I've stayed away from the topic a little bit on purpose because it's so prominent and it's so filled with legends and myths. But of course, you can't fully escape it. But this is something that often happens with history, and it's true of World War One, like it is of other events in history. What actually happens versus the legend of what happens are two very different things, right? So there's this legend that the men on both sides, they really didn't want to fight. They didn't believe in the cause. And so they were quick to join each other in friendship, and they played a football game in no man's land, the British and the Germans, etc., etc.
The way I understood this is that they kind of believed that the war would be over soon anyway, so that it didn't have such an impact of a few days of peace. And I think, if I remember correctly, we spoke about this in our Christmas special, where they kind of said that, oh, the war is probably over by next year, so where's the harm, you know?
Well, yeah, of course, everyone on both sides was hoping that the war would be over as soon as possible. When it didn't end in 1914, everyone planned to end it in 1915 if they could. I think the reason why there were no real Christmas truces in 1915, 16, 17 is, first of all, the army discipline forbid it. It forbid it in 1914 as well, but of course, things were a bit more in flux at the very beginning of the war. But also, the sides became more bitter. The war became, in people's minds, more unforgiving, let's say. Of course, it's not like there was no hatred in 1914. It's not like there was a truce along the whole line in 1914 either. In many places, the shooting continued. People get killed on December 25th, 24th, and 25th, 1914 as well. Those local truces are the exception. They're not the rule. Even though they're such a dramatic and interesting and human exception that they take up a big prominent place in kind of the public memory or the legends about the war. The reality is more people were fighting on that day or shooting each other than there were talking to each other in no man's land. And of course, the football game is totally exaggerated, right?
Yeah. I think you bring up a point as well when you mentioned about humanity, because one of the reasons I believe we've discussed this in our episode as well on the Christmas series again, which I'm referring to, is that if it happened again, they would kind of start looking at their enemies as more human, and then they would refuse to shoot each other, and that would be cause a problem because they saw war they were supposed to, go against each other, and if this happened again, it would be kind of not very well good propaganda, and the troops would begin to be question, why are we fighting these people? These are people as well, which was not the way they were supposed to look at the enemy, that they were the enemy. They were supposed to, we were also going to defeat them and kill them as fast as possible.
I mean, from a purely military point of view, so if you take the sort of human element out of it, from a purely military point of view, yeah, you don't want your soldiers having positive connections with the enemy. One thing I think that sometimes gets a bit overlooked in the discussion about Christmas truces is that they were far more common in the East between the Russians, Germans, and Austro-Hungarians. They were more widespread. It's not like everyone was celebrating together, but they were larger and more common, especially then in 1917, because of course the war starts to break up in the East, right, after the Russian Revolution. So yeah, that I find interesting, especially because in World War II, the fighting in the East is far more horrific and
Oh
far
yeah.
more inhuman, and their intentions towards each other are far less human, let's say. But in the First War, it was more flexible in some aspects than in the West.
And we have to move on, of course, because we have been kind of, for lack of better words, stuck in 1914 for time and talked about a lot of preparation for the war and the beginning of the war. We have to talk about 2015 as well, and we mentioned the Ottomans. When what brings, because they are hesitant in
1915, I think you mean, right?
yeah, 1915, yeah. And they are kind of hesitant in joining you first. And we talked about this in the previous episodes, how it made sense that they wanted to join the Central Powers because the Allied powers just wanted to carve up their territory in Egypt. And what makes them eventually join the war against both Russia and we of course have to mention the Gallipoli campaign, which was an Allied disaster.
Yeah, I mean, the Ottomans are in a tricky situation, right? They're much weaker than the other powers, but they've also been receiving a lot of assistance from Germany before the war. Germany became the kind of primary European ally of the Ottoman Empire in the couple of decades leading up to the First World War. Before that, earlier in the 19th century, it had been Britain. But after the Crimean War, that's a bit less the case. And then the Ottomans feel like, well, we're vulnerable against Russia, and Russia defeats them, right? In the Russo-Turkish War of 1877-78, Russia and Romania together defeat the Ottomans. And so when this new war breaks out, the Ottomans think, well, look, okay, we have a choice here. Our ally, Germany, who has invested in the Ottoman Empire, they've built railways there, they have helped modernize to some extent and equip the army and the navy. What do we do, right? They are now involved in an existential war, a great power war, and Russia is on the other side. And Russia is the main threat to the Ottoman Empire because they want territory in the Caucasus, they want territory they want to control the straits, right? The famous
and they want
straits.
Constantinople.
Exactly, because this is a traditional Russian strategic goal in the region to get access to the Mediterranean, and for cultural reasons, right? Orthodox Christianity comes from or is based in Constantinople at the time for most of its history. So the Ottomans feel like, well, it's in our interest then to join the war on the German side to prevent a Russian victory, because if Russia wins, it's big trouble for the Ottomans in the future. So that's more or less the considerations that go into the Ottoman Empire joining in.
What is worth mentioning as well, you mentioned that Britain and Ottomans were allied, and we do see that the Sultan meet Queen Victoria at some point as well. But at the time before 1914, the British do as well have a naval ship built for the Ottomans, which they eventually end up taking itself. But of course, since the Ottomans joined the Central Powers, that kind of got out of the question to give them the ship.
Well, I mean, it makes sense. The British shipbuilding companies can make money in peacetime building ships for other powers, so that's not completely uncommon. What I wanted to mention was it's kind of ironic because the British, their reason for joining the Crimean War in the 1850s was to protect the Ottoman Empire against the Russians. And now, of course, it's Germany who is seen as the protector of the Ottoman Empire against the Russians. And the British eventually, of course, attacked the Ottoman Empire in Mesopotamia, in Palestine, and the Sinai, and then, of course, briefly, 10 months or whatever, in Gallipoli.
Which is an Allied disaster, and Churchill, of course, is not
It is a
very
disaster. It is a disaster. First, they wanted to send warships through the straits. That fails, right? They hit mines and sink, and then they stop. And there's a debate. Well, if they had kept pushing, maybe they would have succeeded with the warships, and they would have knocked the Ottoman Empire out of the war already in 1915, which would have changed a lot in the course of the war. Not everything, but it would have been a huge Allied victory. But that naval plan fails. So then they land troops. and that eventually also fails because they're just not able to keep them properly in action and push the Turks off of that difficult terrain. One thing that I always try to point out when it comes to Gallipoli, on this topic again of legends coming after the war that are not exactly how things were. Obviously, the most famous part of the battle from the Allied perspective, in the popular history, let's say, is the Anzacs, right? The Australians, New Zealanders. To them, this is such a symbolically important battle in their history that there are movies about it and special ceremonies for it and all this kind of stuff, national holidays to commemorate it. But in fact, there were more British troops that participated in Gallipoli than there were Australian and New Zealanders. And there were more French troops at Gallipoli than there were Australians and New Zealanders. So, of course, it's not wrong that for Australians and New Zealanders, that battle had a lot of symbolic meaning. But I think if we look back on the whole, it's important that we remember that the Allied force was much, much larger and that the French had a very large contingent of troops as well.
And I want to talk about air superiority, because planes were quite new, not superiority, but air warfare. And the planes were quite new to use in warfare at the time, and it was mainly used for bombing. It wasn't until a little bit later that I don't remember his name, but it was a soldier pilot who put a machine gun on his plane, on the wing of the plane, I think, and that's how they started using machine guns on planes. But planes were mainly used for bombing. And how effective were they with the creation of RAF and the German? I don't remember the name of the German air.
Interestingly,
but,
yeah, at first there was the Royal Flying Corps, which then eventually becomes the Royal Air Force on the British side. But air warfare changes a lot over the course of the war. Initially, the main use of airplanes, so fixed structure airplanes, so not Zeppelin balloons, right, but actual airplanes, the way we think of them. The main use at first is reconnaissance, taking pictures. So you can see where the enemy trench is. Maybe you can identify where some artillery emplacements are on those pictures, and then your artillery can bombard those positions. So that's kind of the first uses as an observer. Then those observing planes, they sort of see each other. And so pilots start bringing pistols or rifles or eventually machine guns. But a major change, and this is what you referred to, I think, a major change comes when an engineer on the German side, he's Dutch actually, Fokker is his name. He invents a system where you can mount a machine gun behind the propeller, and it will be timed through a little mechanical, there's like a little lever that the propeller moves each time it rotates, and that controls when the bullets are fired. So it's timed that the bullets will fire in between the propeller blades as the propeller is rotating. Otherwise, if it's not coordinated, your own bullets will just chew off your propeller blades and you're going to crash, right?
Yeah.
So that changes things. The Germans have that first. The Allies eventually copy it. And there's this back and forth where then each side will add some kind of technology and the other will try to get one and copy it. Or one side will come out with a new model of airplane that's a bit better. Then they have the advantage for a few months until the other side comes out with an improved airplane, and back and forth like that.
How safe was it and how reliable were the early planes?
They were not particularly safe. They don't have parachutes. Especially most of the models, it's a frame with fabric stretched over it at first anyway. So if you crash, it's not easy to make a crash landing. Of course, it happens, but death rates among pilots, especially during certain phases of the war, are very, very high. So it's not a very safe occupation, let's say, to have. But I want to talk about the bombing a little bit.
Yeah.
At first, the bombing is not very effective. have very, very small bombs. The air crew have to like pick them up by hand, hold them out over the side, and drop them. So it's not that effective at first, but of course they developed this. And at first, the most effective way to drop bombs is with the airships, the Zeppelins, because they're much bigger, they can hold more bombs, and the Germans do that. They go over to the UK and they drop bombs on various towns there. But even then, it's not enough to make a big strategic difference. Aerial bombing is not advanced enough. The technology is just not advanced enough for it to have a huge impact. By the end of the war, both sides have developed heavier bombers with multiple engines that can go longer distances, and then they do bomb towns, but it's something that, because of the state of the technology at the time, doesn't have a huge impact.
Right. Something that I think is as well a bit overlooked is the German use of Zeppelins. So they seem to be quite popular among German use of air warfare. So, and they do bomb, I believe, the British Isles as well with them. So
Several times, yeah.
How effective were they compared to the early planes of the war?
Well, the advantage is they have a long range. They can go far. They're also bigger, so they can carry more bombs. The problem is they are also not that effective in the end. They can't carry enough bombs to really do significant damage to affect the war effort of the enemy. And they're quite vulnerable also. They're filled with gases that can catch on fire, so they're not that hard to shoot down if you can find them, and they're slow. So they have some serious limitations, and that's why they're used in the war, but they don't play a decisive role in any way.
So we had to move on again, and we had to go to 1916, where you get the famous Battle of Verdun, of course. So how significant was this battle for World War One?
Verdun is a very important battle for a couple of reasons. One is it's the only time on such a scale between October 1914 and March 1918. It's the by far the largest German offensive on the Western Front. So now we have a change of out of the usual, let's say, pattern of the Germans defending, the Allies attacking, where the Germans are trying to attack. But even they, the single most powerful army, fail at that. Right? They're not able to do what they want to do, which, as it turns out, is they want to try to win a battle of attrition against the French. But they're not able to do it. And the French army is able to hold. And that is important for the course of the war, because here you have the most important Allied army, the French one, and the most important Central Powers army, the German one, fighting a massive battle against each other. And the French hold, even though they are on the balance a weaker power than Germany a little bit. So this is a sign for Germany that it's not able to militarily defeat the Western Allies for the foreseeable future unless something changes. And of course, that will change in 1917 when Russia drops out of the war. And that's why the Germans attack in 1918 in the West, because they can. But in 1916, nobody knows that's going to happen. It looks really bad for the Germans at that moment because they have tried to knock out the main Allied army and they can't do it. And for France, they suffered so many losses in 1914 and 15, catastrophic, terrible losses, more than most other powers proportionately. And yet, Verdun is a sign that they are still able to function, still able to fight effectively, and still able to take losses in a major battle. So Verdun is kind of a sign that that the Allies are going to hold in spite of everything, that France is going to hold in spite of everything, and that Germany is not strong enough to win in the West on its own, as long as Russia is still in the war.
And something that we have to talk about this as well before we move on to 1917 is invention of the tanks and in the famous Mark V tanks, and you can see it have a kind of cameo in all quite of the Western Front, but how they weren't very effective in the beginning. And it was sounded really torturous to be inside of one
Yes, it
early
was.
of in the early tanks. But what kept them going? Why didn't they realize that we could develop this, and why didn't they just give up tanks warfare if it was such ineffective in the beginning? You think that they kind of, well, this isn't more gonna work. It's not very
Yeah.
effective, but we're gonna keep going with it.
I mean, both the French and the British developed tanks, different kinds of tanks. The British one is, of course, maybe more famous internationally because it was the first one used in combat in September 1916 in a part of the Battle of the Somme called the Battle of Flers-Courcelette, where Canadian troops played a prominent role. But anyway, you're right. The Mark I tanks are the first kind with the little trailer with the wheels at the back that you sometimes see, and they don't bring much, right? They scare the heck out of a bunch of Germans who run away, but it's not enough. There are not enough of them. They're not reliable. They're too slow. It's very difficult to use them in proper coordination with the infantry. But
it is interesting how they kept pushing on with the tanks, even though, like you said, how ineffective they were.
And I think the reason is it's a new technology, and the British and French believe that there's so much potential in this technology that it's going to be effective if we can make improvements to the machines and if we can make improvements to how we use the machines. Those are two different things, right? So not only do they have to have more reliable tanks, they also have to be able to use those tanks in an effective way. And eventually they experiment, the British do more and more throughout 1917. And in spring 1917, they have another disappointing performance of the tanks at the Battle of Arras. But then, and they can't really use the tanks that much at Passchendaele in 1917 because the conditions are too wet. But at the Battle of Cambrai in November, December 1917, then we see several hundred tanks being a part of this offensive and much, much better coordination between the tanks and the infantry. It still has some difficulties because it's a difficult thing to do. But this combined arms warfare where you have infantry, you have tanks, you have artillery, and then you have aircraft mostly as observers, but still all working in a coordinated plan together, that is something that's going to end up opening up the Western Front from the Allied point of view in 1918. And it's something that begins to take shape. You can already see it happening at Cambrai in November 17. So the tanks don't work too well at first, but the potential is understood or is seen, or it's like partially understood. And it takes time to work towards that, right? And this is true in war, I think, in all time periods. Look at the current war in Ukraine. The use of drones has started to change. Now they have drones doing different things, dropping bombs, or drones with a little weapon on them to shoot at other drones, and all kinds of different things are being modified and tested as the war goes. And it was no different with tanks.
Right. So let's move on to 1917 now, and of course, we're going to talk about America. Actually, I want to, before we move on to the Russian Revolution, which we are going to talk about in a second, I want to talk about America before, and I want to talk about Woodrow Wilson a little bit, because he comes up with the term national self-determination. And what is national self-determination, and why was it became quite popular on the German side as well, and it caught on. So what made national self-determination so effective, and what was the point of national self-determination?
Well, I think the intention on Wilson's part was to create a concept that would help Europe resolve some of its problems. He and many people saw the cause of the war and the cause of a lot of war in oppression and empire. Now, of course, the US also had an empire, right? With the Philippines,
Yeah.
with Guam, and they occupied some Caribbean islands like Haiti and Cuba at different times.
Didn't they have Panama at the point, or was it?
1914, yeah.
Yeah.
Of course, they also conquered much of the United States
Mm.
from Mexico and from the indigenous peoples, but still, they didn't see themselves that way necessarily.
Of
They
course they
looked
didn't.
at they looked at the old empires in Europe, and that there were different national groups that were being oppressed, and this is part of the evil of empire, and that can be hopefully resolved if every national group just has their own state. That would be what a nice world it would be, right? You
Yeah.
wouldn't have these autocratic empires like Germany, Russia, and Austria-Hungary anymore, or at least autocratic in the view of Wilson and people who thought like him. The problem is, on the one hand, self-determination theoretically means one state for one group of people, but that doesn't correspond to reality, and that's a big problem. So populations are mixed in many parts of Europe, identities are mixed. For centuries and centuries, people have not been organized based on national group. There was no such thing as the idea of a national group for most of European history. It only comes later, especially in the 19th century. So they don't settle in nice little borders. All the Poles live in this border, all the Germans live in this border, all the whoever, Romanians, Hungarians live in it. They're mixed because for centuries that's how it worked. And that's how humans settle and are and move over history. So the idea of self-determination then becomes appealing to everyone who wants to make it what's convenient to them.
You're right.
So for the Italians, it's super convenient. Self-determination means we should also own Italian historical lands, which are now a part of Austria-Hungary, right? Doesn't matter if there are a lot of German speakers or a lot of Slovene speakers in those areas. Our self-determination as Italy means that historically they are ours and we should have that. Whereas the Austrians then, well, let's say the Austrians after, when the war is ended or ending, and you have the Republic of Austria, they say, well, okay, but self-determination means we should be with other German speakers.
Yeah.
So Italy should not get South Tyrol because most people there speak German. Czechoslovakia should not have its border regions with Austria because that's a place where most people speak German. And even the Austrians say we want to join with Germany because we should be one state. That's self-determination, right? And the Germans then, at the end of the war, they also say, well, if the new peace is going to be based on self-determination, we can't let Poland have these territories in the east because we say they are German. And look, there are some German speakers who live there. Even in some little spots, they're the majority. So self-determination is a kind of utopian idea in a way that is impossible to achieve. And this is one of the reasons why so many are unhappy with the peace settlement, because everyone puts so much hope in self-determination, but it's not a realistic concept. And of course, it's also not a fairly applied concept. So Hungary, for example, after the peace settlement, they're angry because they say, hey, look at all these Hungarians who are now stuck in Czechoslovakia, stuck in Romania, stuck in Yugoslavia. It's not fair. We want self-determination. But Hungary was on the losing side. So the idea was not applied the same. Where there's a mixed region, where you can't really decide, the peace conference gives that region, generally speaking, to states that were not a part of the Central Powers directly. So Austria, Hungary, and Germany kind of lose out in the way that self-determination is interpreted. Italy a little bit as well, because they don't get as much as they want. And they're also very upset afterwards.
Italy seemed to get support from the Allied powers as well, that they claim to these areas, historical areas, as you mentioned.
Yeah, well, Italy is is a complicated case because, of course, initially they're allied to Germany and Austria-Hungary, but they don't join them when the war begins. And then at the peace conference, they have some serious demands for territory in the former territory of Austria-Hungary, but that goes against other allied interests because now the Allies, they create Yugoslavia, well, what will become Yugoslavia. At the time, it's called the Kingdom of Serbs, Croats, and Slovenes. And Yugoslavia's claims overlap with Italy's claims. So what do you do? And the populations are mixed. There are some Italians there. There are some Slovenes there. There are some Croats there in these border area. And the Allies decide, well, we're going to give some to Italy and some to Yugoslavia.
Yeah.
Because they want Yugoslavia to be as powerful as possible so that it will be a future ally of France and Britain. This makes Italy extremely angry because they say, we fought, we died on the Allied side, and now we're not getting everything that we want, right? So Italy ends up then kind of being opposed to its former allies after the war. And it's one of the factors that brings fascism to Italy as well. So Italy is a strange and complicated case. And all this comes from the new prominence of Wilson and the US entering the war in 1917, and then his 14 points in January 1918, to bring it back to your question after all that.
And we have to talk about, of course, a significant factor in, and we're going back to the Eastern Front. We haven't been there in a while and thought about, because it's kind of disaster that Germany is coming in on Russia, but something that happens is the Russian Revolution, of course. But and I'm gonna really simplify this because it's such a big factor of history that it needs its own episode eventually. Because there is two kind of revolutions in, you got the February Revolution with Kerensky, and then you got, of course, the Bolsheviks tried in July, but they failed, and then you got the October Revolution, and the Tsar abdicates in. Of course, I'm simplifying this really, really well, but not simplifying here, but the Tsar abdicates in February. The Kerensky takes office, and they become a massive part of the Russian offensive in, you got the infamous Kerensky offensive, which was, if I remember correctly, a disaster. And then you got the Bolshevik Revolution, where Russia takes out, which happened in November according to the Russian calendar,
the calendar
but they say
difference,
October Revolution, of course. But how does this impact Germany, the Russian Revolution, and the peace treaty with Lenin?
Well, it's a huge change in the war. It's a seismic change in the war because the Russian army is massive and it's much better equipped in 1916-17 than it is in 1914-15. So it represents a huge force. But as you summarized, right, there are these two revolutions. First, the Tsar abdicates, a provisional republican government takes over, and Kerensky is the most famous figure in that whole thing. And they try to continue the war. They basically say, well, Russia's interests are still in continuing this war to a victorious conclusion. We have agreements with our allies and so on. But the state is now kind of too vulnerable.
So something that we have to, sorry for interrupting you again, but we have to talk about as well is that the Russian army after the February is just really messy, and people indisciplined after because they don't know what to do when they drop the leader.
It starts to get messier,
and the
soldiers start to organize themselves. It holds the line. So it's not like it's not like it completely disappears, but it's not the same. It's not the same force. It's not as reliable as it was before. Of course, there is this so-called Kerensky offensive in the summer of 1917. Russian armies do attack. They have some success at first, but the army is not able to continue. The discipline is no longer there. The morale is no longer there. Things at home are drawing the soldiers' attention back. Some of them desert to go back home because in their village now land is being redistributed and they want land. They're peasants. This is important to them, right? They're peasant farmers. So summer 1917 is really the last gasp of the Russian army as a potential, difference maker, and it shows that it's not anymore. That it's become too weak and too vulnerable, even though it's much better equipped than it ever was before.
I believe, if I remember correctly, Trotsky, in his work on the history of the Russian Revolution, really goes hard against. He's not really a fan, if I remember correctly, of Kerensky.
No kidding. That's definitely true. Trotsky is not a fan of the bourgeois government of Republican Russia at that time. So then, of course, the Bolsheviks, they launch essentially a violent coup and take power in October then / November, depending which calendar you're using. And that's the end for Russia, right? In the war,
Yeah.
in the First World War. And then this changes the game completely for Germany, or so they hope, because this is the break they've been waiting for, right? Now they can transfer troops to the West. It takes some time because the Bolsheviks draw out the negotiations, they delay, and eventually the Germans have to march farther into Russia to force the Bolsheviks to accept a peace treaty. But it does work, and the Germans are then able to bring fresh troops west. They still keep a lot of men in the east to occupy all the areas that they took from Russia, including Ukraine, right? And they created
You mentioned the puppet state, yeah.
They created it wasn't 100% a puppet state, but under Central Powers control, and occupied militarily as well at some point. But anyway, the point is the Germans bring troops to the West and launch a desperate final offensive. They know that they're losing. They know they're desperate. They have to win before their resources run out and the American army can be built up. And of course, they fail at that, right? They gain a bunch of territory, but they don't break the Allied armies. It creates a crisis. It's a real bad situation for the Allies, but the Germans fail, and their morale and their discipline begins to break, and their army will start to weaken. People will start to desert from the German army in the fall of 1918.
Something we have to talk about, of course, is American entry into the war, and that the infamous Zimmerman telegram, which was sent to Mexico to try to hope that Mexico would attack, because they were friendly to Germany, which just kind of makes sense, with like you said, with the attack and the war with US and Mexico. But it makes sense that but the Zimmerman. How did they find out about the Zimmerman telegram?
Well, because the British found it. So the British are monitoring German communication with their embassies, right? Because it's going across undersea cables, and so the British are able to also recognize that this telegram has been sent. But the aspect of this whole Zimmerman issue that I find the most interesting is why the Germans admitted that it was real. Because, theoretically, they could have tried to deny more plausible deniability, let's say, but they admitted that it was real. And this, of course, is a diplomatic disaster for the Germans, and it of course contributes to the anti-German feelings in the US.
And how quickly does Wilson? And before I talk about the entry, I want to ask you, because is this a myth, or is it true that Britain kind of attacked American vessels to try to get America into the world, or is that more a myth?
No,
overstated.
British ships did not attack American vessels to try to get them into the war. What they did do, which had the opposite effect, which really made the Americans angry, was sometimes they stopped and checked American cargo ships, especially carrying mail and post, because they wanted to make sure that the Germans were not trying to do something on those neutral American ships or send certain things, ship items that were forbidden, get around this blockade. So sometimes the British did check some American ships, and this created a lot of tension between Britain and the United States before the United States entered the war. But they didn't attack American ships. No, that would be crazy.
Mm. So they do have a journal. How significant is it? Is of course massive significant for the change of the outcome of the war. But were the Germans still losing at this point in 1917 when the Germans entered? Could they have lost without American entry?
Oh, that's a good question. I would say yes. The Germans could have lost without American entry. And the reason I say that is because there's no guarantee that the second Russian Revolution is going to happen. So if we're looking at counterfactuals, then we have to consider several different options, not just one. So it is possible that the US doesn't enter, but Russia doesn't drop out. And if that's the case, Germany cannot win. In addition, if you look at how 1918 plays out, the Americans only really start seriously fighting with a lot of troops participating in the fighting in about September 1918. So by that time, Germany is already losing badly. And the tide turns on the battlefield in the West in July and early August when the French launch a massive counterattack, and then the British on August 8th launch a massive counterattack. Those two counterattacks are working. The Germans are losing, they're retreating before the big American battles begin, the big American involvement begins. Now, of course, it is very useful to have an extra 2 million US troops in Europe. This helps the Allies win and helps them maybe win a bit faster. But the main US contribution is probably money, supplies, and ammunition, and a boost to morale, because the Germans know the Americans are there and going to get stronger, and the Allies also know it. So if the war had continued into 1919, the US would have played a much more decisive role on the battlefield.
This is probably a stupid question, but there has been no chance that the US might have joined the German side in this. There's like no way they would have.
I don't think so. I don't think so. It's just not in their interest, really. The one exception would have been if the British had adopted a crazy policy of being aggressive towards American shipping, because we know that this is something that provokes the US into military action against Germany, and it provoked the US into military action against Britain back in 1812. So that is one possible way, but it's so unlikely. That's why it didn't happen, basically.
Before we go to the Treaty of Versailles, there's something I want to mention as well, and I feel like it's just worth mentioning in passing. Is that the Germans, as well, we've talked about the Ottoman Gallipoli campaign, but the Ottoman Sultan met fifth, I believe, at the time. Not the sixth one comes after World War II, I believe. But the Wilhelm II, he tried to speak to the Sultan, and he do launch a jihad against the Allied power, but it of course fails because as we talked about in the with Eugene Rodin on the history of the Arabs, they are just humans, and the jihad kind of became irrelevant in the modern era.
At this time, the jihad that is called by the Sultan, who's also the Caliph of the Muslim world at this time, right? It doesn't work. I mean, the idea is the French and British have so many Muslim subjects living in their empires, living in their colonies, that maybe if they call out jihad, and there are many Muslims in the Russian Empire as well, can't forget about them, the Tatars and Bashkirs and Muslim peoples there, or Caucasian peoples in the Russian Empire as well who are Muslim. So the Germans feel like maybe this will cause some difficulties for the Allies, because maybe there will be some religious Muslim uprisings against them in their empires. But it doesn't work. It is true, I have read some interesting collections of letters, for example, from British Muslim Indian soldiers serving in the Middle East, fighting the Turks, who say, isn't it a shame that we're fighting fellow Muslims, but it doesn't mean that they're going to go on a jihad against the British.
There were some worrying in the Allied powers that this could have a massive effect, but of course it doesn't. But there is some worrying.
Yes,
Yeah.
they always worry that their colonial subjects will rise up against them. This is a constant worry if you have an empire. And yes, there's some concern, but it doesn't amount to anything significant.
There is one person I haven't mentioned so far, and simply because we haven't had time to discuss every detail. I wish we could, but we all have stuff to do, unfortunately. But there's one General Erich Ludendorff, who is kind of significant to the loss of Germany because he has a tremendous amount of pressure. He's one of the foremost generals in the war of Kaiser Wilhelm II, and he suddenly collapsed because he can't take it anymore. There has been theorized, I believe, David Stevenson in his book mentioned is that if he hadn't collapsed, it could have gone on for a little longer. But it does collapse eventually, and this is a significant factor to the loss of Germany and the Treaty of Versailles.
I mean, I think I would look at it a little bit the other way around. So you could look at it and say, okay, well, a very important general, has this kind of breakdown in the fall, and that accelerates the German defeat. Or you could say that the Germans are already being defeated, and that accelerates the personal breakdown of the general. And I think that's the side that I would take, is that he realizes that the war is lost, and that contributes to the pressure on him, and that contributes to his breakdown. And then, of course, he tells the government that the war is lost and they should seek an armistice now and not later, before things get worse.
And so, before again, there's some things that we haven't discussed that's kind of important as well. Just we mentioned this in the past before we come to Versailles. I want to go back a little bit because gas is used not significantly, and I want to talk about this a little bit before we go to the Versailles, because it's used by both Allied and flamethrowers as well. It's a new invention in the war, in the First World War. So let's talk about the gas and use of flamethrowers during the war.
The Germans have the most advanced chemical industry in the world at this time, right? They're the world leaders in chemical production. So it's not an accident that they are the first to invent both of those weapons. They first used the flamethrowers in 1915, but it's not like a war-winning weapon. It's useful in some situations, like at Verdun or whatever, where there's like forts and you have to get at enemies that are in these entrenched and covered positions, or fortified and covered positions.
You're quite vulnerable too, aren't you? When you go out there in no man's land, you don't have just your gun, I presume, and when it's quite heavy equipment, so you are quite vulnerable. When you go while they are dangerous, you are quite vulnerable still to open fire.
In no man's land, you're very vulnerable to things like shrapnel from artillery, right? That's bursting above you. When the flamethrower is most effective is when you have defenders that are in some kind of concrete bunker or fort, because it's a closed space. So the flames can be more effective in a closed space, and the defenders don't have as much area to get away. Right? So if it's pouring rain and windy and you're trying to use a flamethrower in the middle of no man's land, it's not as effective, but you're also more vulnerable as the user of the flamethrower. Whereas in a situation like, okay, you're in the tunnels of Fort Vaux or Douaumont in Verdun, then it's a more effective weapon. But it doesn't change the overall outcome of the war. The most important weapon remains artillery. And this is true for gas as well. They test it, the Germans do, first on the Russians on the Eastern Front. Then they use it for the first time on the Western Front at the Second Battle of Ypres in April 1915. And it's a huge shock. The Allies are not expecting it, they're not prepared for it. And it hits first an Algerian division and a Canadian division next to it. And they are, of course, driven back. because they have no defense
Mm.
against this and they don't expect it. The Canadians are able to recover. The Algerians, not so much. Unfortunately, they were hit even worse. But the Canadians are able to recover and prevent a breakthrough. And my great great uncle was killed in that action as well. But gas, even though then later there are different kinds of gas invented, that was chlorine used at Second Ypres.
That's
And
what caused Hitler to come to the hospital too, wasn't it?
I don't know if it was chlorine, but it was some sort of poison gas. I don't remember. Later, they invent other kinds like phosgene and the infamous mustard gas. And it's usually the Germans inventing these kinds first and then the Allies copying after, because the Germans had, like I say, they were more advanced for chemistry, in chemistry. It's gas is not effective at killing people, as strange as that sounds to us when we imagine it. But once gas masks come in, it's
It
not very
will be
effective at
later.
killing people. Yeah, later kinds like with nerve gases and stuff, that's a whole different ballgame. But
Cyclone B, for example.
World War I gas is not effective at killing people. It can be effective at really making soldiers' jobs harder and more unpleasant. So, for example, if you are trying to defend yourself in a trench, or if you are part of an artillery crew and you're working the guns, and there's gas shells blowing up around you, you have to put your gas mask on. It's hot, it's uncomfortable, you can't see well, you can't hear well. And of course, you're stressed because you know if there's a problem with your gas mask, you're going to inhale gas and be wounded, or potentially, rarely, but you might also die. And so gas is kind of like a suppressor weapon in a way. You can really hinder the effectiveness of the other guy fighting, even if you can't kill him very often with gas. You can really make him have difficulties doing his job as a soldier. And that's essentially the purpose for poison gas in the First World War, the main purpose.
And again, now we said that get to Versailles in a second, but what was the number of casualties, both civilian? Of course, civilian is a bit harder to define, but what was the casualties on the fronts of World War One?
Overall, I mean, of course, we can't know exactly because the scale is too vast. But historians estimate something like around 9 to 10 million soldiers were killed, and probably up to about 10 million civilians died as a result of the war. Some of them.
And there was a pandemic as well. The Spanish flu
Yes, there's the Spanish
helping.
flu
Was not
also.
helping.
Yeah. But in terms of civilian deaths, I think we underestimate that sometimes. I think the one people are most aware of is probably the Armenian genocide in the Ottoman Empire, which is anywhere between 800,000 and 1.5 million, if I remember right about the estimates. But we have to also remember that in the Central Powers, people are dying from malnutrition and diseases related to malnutrition, hundreds of thousands of them. And in the areas of the Russian Empire that are occupied by the Central Powers, there's also a massive food shortage. So people in former Russian Poland start dying from malnutrition and related diseases while they're under occupation. The Austro-Hungarians kill several tens of thousands of Serbian civilians and Ukrainian civilians as well, whom they suspected of being traitors and cooperating with the Russians. So typhus, there's a huge typhus outbreak as well in Eastern Europe in 1917, 18 and beyond that kills hundreds of thousands. And there's a huge famine in the former Ottoman Empire or the Ottoman Empire starting in 1918, where in Lebanon, for example, many, many people starved to death. So all these things together, and of course, then there are all the African porters, because of course there's a whole campaign in Africa that we haven't, that we won't have time to get to probably today, but there are very few soldiers, but there are so many hundreds of thousands of African porters who are carrying all the supplies for the different small armies moving around, and they are dying of exhaustion, of disease, and we don't know how many there were of them because they didn't keep proper records, the colonial powers. So this is how we get these large figures of civilian dead, even though it's not as much as the Second World War, of course.
And something we have to mention as well is, and we don't have time to go through all of them, but Wilson's 14 points is, of course, infamous in the First World War.
Well, I think the famous one is about self-determination, right? There are others, but some of them sort of fit into that.
No territorial gain, which is of course the
right.
which of course the British ignored, kind of.
No secret, no secret deals between countries and all that kind of stuff. He gets very specific sometimes, which says Poland should have access to the sea and that kind of stuff. So it's a mixed bag. They have a huge impact on people's hopes for the war. Everybody in the Allied countries thinks, oh, yes, he's going to come and we're going to have peace based on some combination of these points. But then in the Central Powers, people are also thinking the same thing because they see it as something that will benefit them and protect them from the Allies if they lose the war. And then in the end, most are partly disappointed by it. And the peace treaty, because this leads us nicely into the peace treaty, the series of peace treaties is not only one, right? There's what you could call a Versailles system. So there's the Treaty of Versailles with Germany. There's the Treaty of Saint-Germain with the Republic of Austria. There's the Treaty of Trianon with Hungary. There's the Treaty of Neuilly with Bulgaria. And then at first there's the Treaty of Sèvres with the Ottomans, but that eventually, because of the war that happens there, and then we get the Republic of Turkey, eventually that becomes the Treaty of Lausanne in 1923. So there's a whole system of treaties. And essentially, it's a no-win situation if you're trying to remake the European order. There's going to be people unhappy everywhere, and that's how it turned out.
And of course, something that we have to mention as well is that while the Treaty of Versailles was a final peace, there was the Allied powers agreed to not make a separate, and that's one of the reasons why the war went on so long, is that they agreed no separate peace with Germany or no separate peace outside the Allied agreement, right? So that's one of the reasons why the war went on for as long as it did, because they didn't have separate deals, and not and which of course Russia eventually did because of the revolution. But for the other Allied powers, there were no separate deals.
Right, which makes sense if you're the Allies, because you don't want the other guy jumping ship. And the Central Powers had the same concept, right? Germany reacted very badly when they found out that Austria-Hungary was testing the waters a little bit about maybe there could be some peace talks. And Germany became afraid that Austria was looking for a separate peace and threatened the Austrians and increased their control, or let's say their influence over Austrian decision-making at that point in 1916. So neither side was willing to have a separate peace until, dramatic events occur like Russian Revolution, or eventually then the Bulgarians have to sign a peace because they're about to be completely occupied in September 1918. So yeah.
And of course, the Kaiser eventually abdicated at the Weimar Republic, which eventually lead to the Third Reich, and we have Danzig becoming a free city, and we had got for no real territorial gain. Britain carves up the Middle East, which kind of ignores Wilson's points on no territorial gain, which I kind of find kind of funny. That sure, no territorial gain, except maybe not in Europe. The way I look at this, well, but
the way the British and French got around that, of course, they are not interested in self-determination, right? Because they have empires. So why would they want that? They play the game with Wilson because they have to, but of course they don't want self-determination for their own colonial empires. Then is the question, well, what do you do with the Ottoman Empire?
Right.
And the French and British feel like, well, I mean, we fought them, so we want to gain something from it. But the US won't allow them to openly expand their empires. So one of the main points of the peace plan is to create the League of Nations, right? The early United Nations, to resolve conflicts.
Which was a failure, of course.
Eventually, it's a failure, but that's not clear at the beginning. At the beginning, it seems like the new and awesome thing. So the way the solution that is found is that in the Middle East, they'll say, okay, we're going to create these new states, Transjordan, Iraq, and Greater
Palestine.
Syria, right? Palestine and Transjordan were kind of at first they were together, but yes, eventually they were divided. So, and we don't want to. It's not okay politically for the French and British to say, "Oh yeah, these are just going to be parts of our empires." So they say, "Well, theoretically, we want self-determination for all peoples." So some people, though, are not 100% ready for it yet, and that means that a developed country, so-called developed country, will be given a mandate, so be given kind of the responsibility from the League of Nations,
protectorates,
right, to take care of those underdeveloped countries until they're ready for independence in the future. And what that means, of course, is that Britain takes the mandate over Palestine, Transjordan, and Iraq, and France takes the mandate over Syria, which eventually becomes Syria and Lebanon, divided. And they treat them like a part of their empire. So technically, it's not empire. In practice, they treat them like a part of the empire.
Yeah. And they had no intention, of course, of letting them gain independence.
No.
But one country that do get independence, and I just feel like this is worth mentioning in passing, is Ireland, because they do get not Northern Ireland, but Ireland do get independence because they do help fight in the World War, which was one of the deals why they would get independence in, I believe, 21, I think.
22, the Free State becomes independent. Many Irish served in the British Army, while some other Irish were rebelling against the British at the same time. And then after the war ends, the Anglo-Irish War breaks out, and many Irish veterans who fought with the British in World War I end up fighting against the British in the Anglo-Irish War. And then there's a peace treaty, but some of the Irish feel it's not enough because it's still separated and because they would still be part of the empire, even though they would have their own government. So then there's a civil war between the Irish themselves.
This is the creation of the IRA, of course, which is a history in itself.
That is a history in itself. And eventually then Ireland accepts its status as a free state, still connected to the British Empire. And then eventually it becomes a full separate republic on its own. And yes, the genesis of this is in the First World War in part as well.
Thank you so much for coming on. We're gonna round it up there. I hope you liked this episode. Before you go, do you have anything you want to promote? Any social media? You're on Twitter, I know, and your YouTube channel, which you forgot to mention. If you listen this far, you can. You're more than welcome to plug any links you like in the description that you want me to.
I want to thank you for having me on the show. I enjoyed talking about it. I'm the host of the Great War channel on YouTube. I'm also the host of the Real Time History channel on YouTube. You can also find me on Twitter. And if you would like to support humanitarian aid going to Ukraine, check out the link in the description, because I volunteer with a charity here in Vienna, and it's worth your time to have a look.
I donated myself, like I said in the beginning, and I highly recommend anyone else to do the same. This has been that H12. My name is Alan. Please check out some other episodes. If you like this episode, you're definitely going to find something you like. We are available on YouTube, Spotify, Apple Podcasts, wherever you can find podcasts these days. If you're on iTunes, please leave us a review. That would be most appreciated. Please like, share, and subscribe, and I'll see you next time.